What's the best way to learn PKing in old school RuneScape? LMS? Rev caves? Maybe wildy bosses? I've thought a lot about how to make a useful guide for new PKers, but with so much to learn, no single video can realistically cover everything. So instead, this series will cover PvP one piece at a time. I'm not a PvP prodigy, and that's exactly the point. My mistakes are still fresh, and I've learned a lot from them. Hopefully, so will you. This is a noob's guide to the wilderness. What is wrong with me, dude? What the fish? He was a good sport, but I was so bad. When you just started out, it feels like any fight against an experienced PKer is basically just lost by default. And the main reason behind that is a difference in switching ability. It's just impossible to process how fast everything is happening in advanced PvP, especially when you haven't done it much yourself. I think mentally this might be a roadblock for a lot of people who'll watch a good PKer and think, I'll never learn that anyway, so why bother trying? And that's really a shame, because you absolutely will get better at switches the more you PK. You just can't expect to make any big leaps overnight. And that's usually what motivates people to fight through a steep learning curve. The honest truth about switches is that it takes practice, a lot of practice to get better. But on the positive side, all you need to do to get better at switching is to PK. There isn't much knowledge to remember or strategy to incorporate. To put it in practical terms, it's really just teaching your pointer finger to click in really fast succession while moving it precisely to the right spots on the screen. With that in mind, this video won't give you tips that significantly improve your switches by tomorrow morning. I don't think that's even possible. Instead, it's about finding the best ways to improve your switches most effectively over time, and also how to get the best PKing experience, given that your switches might not be that advanced just yet. Switches mainly consist of gear switches and prayer switches, but you also need to do a lot of other clicking activity in between. So it isn't as much about learning gear and prayer switches separately, it's really more about learning how everything flows together. Let's begin with what usually comes to mind first when talking about the subject: gear switches. I'd recommend to start out with a 3-way switch consisting of top, legs and weapon. If you watched my first videos, I actually started out with a 4-way, but I was terrible. You can learn this however you like, but personally, I think a 3-way is a good starting point. Things improving your switches mechanically take some time. What you're really looking for in the first place is a way to make the switching ability you currently possess more effective. Specifically, it's better if you can make a 3-way switch into a series of 1- and 2-way switches, a 4-way switch into a series of 1- and 3-way switches, and so on. What is commonly referred to as tank flicking. If you watch, fight or listen to any advanced PKer, they will always tell you to stay in your tank. And to recap the tanking video, your tank is your best defensive top and bottoms and your staff. So tank flicking in a 3-way just means that after every range or melee hit, you switch back to your staff, and after every mage hit, you switch back to your tank top and bottoms. But why does everyone recommend this? The reason most commonly given for tank flicking is that your defensive bonuses are the best in this gear. Your tank gear gives the best range and melee defense, while your staff provides some pretty good mage defense. So logically, the more time you spend in this gear, the less damage you will take. And while this is absolutely true, it is by no means the only reason to use this switching strategy. An issue most new PKers will encounter is being too easily reactable, because they can't consistently one-tick their switches. So when a more advanced PKer sees mage robes being equipped 2 or 3 ticks before the spell is being cast, they'll have time to react and pray mage pretty much every time. You will always want to switch into your attack style in as few game ticks as possible, ideally just in 1 tick. So when you're working on your PvP skills, you'll want to learn doing your full switch and hit in one smooth motion. In general, 1-tick switching is easiest for range and melee, with spellcasting and 1-tick speccing being significantly more difficult. Let's explain by a simple example. If you don't do tank flicks and just switch straight up between attack styles, going from mage to range, you'll need to do a full 3-way and then click your opponent, meaning you essentially need to do 4 clicks in 1 tick to do a switch that isn't reactable. Going from range to mage, you'll need to do a full 3-way, switch to a spellbook, click the spell and then click your opponent, so a total of 5 clicks. But if you instead do tank flicks after every hit, going from mage to range, you'll need to switch to your tank top and bottoms right after your spell cast, then switch to a crossbow and click your opponent when you hit him. So instead of needing 4 clicks in one tick, you need 2 clicks after your last hit and then only 2 more when you hit him again. And this is just way easier to do when your switches aren't at a high level. Similarly, going from range to mage, you'll equip your staff right after your bolt, then switch to ropes, click the spell, and then your opponent. So instead of 5, only 4 clicks is needed in one tick. Still difficult, but not as difficult. So by tank flicking, not only do we take less hits in ropes, we've also reduced the amount of clicks we need to do in one tick by dividing our switching sequence into 2 parts. It's a little tricky to get into at first, but once you learn the rhythm, this will demand less clicking speed overall. Doing tank flicks automatically also makes it easier to be unpredictable. By always going back to a gear set that can be easily switched into a range, mage or melee hit, you're constantly forcing your opponent to consider his overheads. For consecutive range hits, just equipping your staff to then switch back to the crossbow and bolt your opponent might force a lot of mage prayers, even though you need nothing more than a one-way weapon switch. This is the easiest way you can force your opponent to predict your switches instead of reacting to them. And this is what high-level enaging is all about. The higher the skill level of an enage fight, reactions will matter less and predictions will matter more. Every PKer good enough to one-tick most switches will be unreactable for the most part, thus demanding their opponent to predict their attack patterns, because reacting to their switches isn't possible anymore. This got a little technical, but I do think it's important for new PKers to understand all the benefits of tank flicking. Now, let's zoom out again and look at the simplest way to set up a switching method for a beginner PKer. The easiest way for a beginner to develop a solid switching rhythm is to start with a 3-way switch using these 3 spots in the bottom left of the inventory, having your melee switches and optionally a defender in the row below. You'll want to have it in the bottom left of the invent to make the distance your cursor have to travel as short as possible, left because it's closer to the game screen, and bottom because it's closer to your spells and prayers. There is nothing wrong with top switching, some of the best PKers in the game does this, but for beginners, minimizing mouse movement generally makes it easier if you can't fling your cursor around with lightning speed and pinpoint precision just yet. Now, every time you hit your opponent with range or melee, you'll need to equip your staff instantly after you see the XP drop. This is extremely important, as you'll need as much time as possible to avoid losing ticks before your next hit. If you just mage, you should similarly equip your tank armor right away. Another benefit of doing this is that it also ensures your items stay on the same spot, so you don't end up screwing your inventory setup every time you decide to melee. In the beginning of a fight, you can get away with ranging quite a lot. Just do a lot of this staff to crossbow, then quickly back to staff. It really doesn't require too advanced mechanics. You do need to patiently wait the full 5 ticks before you equip the crossbow, then do your best to click both crossbow and your opponent on the same tick. The timing of this will mess up a lot in the beginning, but it will become instinctive and natural pretty quickly. So when your opponent sees you faking a staff to then bolt anyway over and over, he'll probably stop praying range at some point. From here on, you'll have to start maging more. Mage switches are significantly harder than the others, so let's try and make them as easy as possible. You should rearrange your spellbook so the spells you use in the fight are on the furthest left column. Since your ropes are also on the left, this enables you to do your mage switches with only vertical mouse movement. So you do a vertical 2-way, switch to your spellbook, then 1-tick flick your spell into your opponent. This might take 2 to 3 ticks at first, but just work on doing this in 1 tick and you'll get there over time. When you're good enough to transition into a 4-way, this vertical line can easily be extended by placing the 3rd mage switch above the ropes, so you can do a vertical 3-way into the spellcast. In my opinion, this is the most noob-friendly way to utilize mage without taking too many hits in your ropes, which is really what I see beginners struggle with the most. For melee, standard hits are exactly the same as range, but specking is significantly harder. Your spec web should be on one of the 2 bottom rows, as this allows you to keep the cursor in place when you switch to the spec bar. To do a proper 1-tick spec, you'll have to be pretty fast with clicking your weapon, then the spec bar and then your opponent. And you'll most likely have a bunch of mishaps where you don't properly click the spec bar and just whack, or worse, fire off an ill-advised crossbow or staff spec. Overall, I think this is a good baseline to begin with. Getting into the habit of tank flicking consistently is easy to get lazy with, especially when killing PVMers or similar targets who doesn't pose much of a threat. It might not be as naturally applicable as just freestyling, but in the long run, it will teach you better switching habits for all PvP situations. I'll keep this pretty quick as I already covered the defensive side in my tanking video. But in short, you want to delay your overhead switch as close to your opponent hitting you as possible, so he can't just see your prayer and adjust. For a more in-depth explanation, go watch my guide on tanking. It's among my better ones. For offensive prayers, main accounts will have Piety, Augury and Rigor lined up nicely below your protection prayers. So you really just want to flick the two prayers in the same motion. Delaying the switch also fits nicely with offensive prayers, as deciding on your own attack style is also better on a little delay. So just consider it a long two-way switch, and though it might be difficult at first, I'd advise to make this a habit pretty early on, as both the offensive and defensive buffs on these prayers are just absolutely massive. For beginners, I'd recommend prioritizing protection prayers over gear switches at first. Prayer switches is just one click, whereas gear switches demand significantly more mouse activity. So if a new PKer needs to minimize the disadvantage he has against an advanced one, learning how to predict your opponent's attacks is usually easier than spending all your brain capacity on gear switching to then get ripped apart because you forgot all about your prayers. I'm not saying you should just stand still and bolt rag the entire fight, but try and prioritize switching your overhead before you switch into your gear. Delay as much as you can, tap the overhead and go directly into the gear switch. When you're in the process of learning, switches can be extremely inconsistent. For no particular reason, you can literally go from PKing at your highest potential to fumbling and dragging your gear all over your invent, and this can instantly switch day by day or even by the hour. This is incredibly frustrating and really something that can plummet your motivation and make you feel like you haven't improved at all. But that's the thing. Your average switching ability will improve slow and steady over time, but since day-to-day variation is so high, your worst days can still feel like you haven't PK'd your entire life. The obvious solution is of course to just play through it, but there are a few tips that might help you get out of these slumps. First is a tip I got from Dino on a day where I was struggling heavily. If your mechanics feel off, you need to slow down and make sure you do the switches properly rather than quickly. It's just more important to get rid of your fumbling than to switch at lightning speed, and most importantly, rebuilding up to a good switching rhythm is done best by starting slow and increasing the pace bit by bit, instead of going way too fast and hoping for everything to magically click at some point. So in short, if you're struggling, avoid forcing a higher pace that you can manage and just try to be slow and smooth instead. You will switch better and your body will hurt less. And while you're here, why don't you practice your clicks by hitting that like button below the video? That would make me very happy. My last tip is to go for some challenging fights every once in a while. In the beginning, this might just be LMS. Later on, you might go to World 304 Altar and get your head bashed. In my experience, if I spend too much time killing PVMers, I end up getting lazy with my tank flicks and start PKing worse overall. And at that point, I need to fight some demons and get smoked for an hour or two to sort of wake myself up. For any PK activity in the wilderness, you will have brews as your main food and only bring a few fish along with it. Since you have so few combo fish, it's important to keep HP high so you won't have to constantly brew when your opponent catches a little momentum. Because of this, you'll want to get into a habit of brewing up between your attacks to stay high HP. The key difference between fighting with brews and fighting with fish is maintaining high HP. If you have a bunch of fish as an LMS or PvP arena, you can always eat back up if you're taken low throughout the fight. But in Deep Wild, you can only do that once or twice, so you really can't get too sloppy with your HP bar. Fortunately, this synergizes well with tank flicking, as you can brew up, restore or combat pot between switching to your tank and going for your next attack. Doing this, you can create a nice switching rhythm where you stay in your tank, maintain high HP, and are still able to attack your opponent back and avoid losing hits. As an added benefit to this, potting or brewing also conceals your weapon, so failing your one-tick switch isn't that obvious to your opponent. A great habit to learn is to do a so-called pot trick by combat potting before your special attack, both hiding your weapon and maximizing your stats before your spec. Let's take a look at the best activities to practice your switches. First, let's tackle one of the most polarizing minigames in old school, LMS. There is a lot, and I do mean a lot, of PK aspects that LMS doesn't teach you at all. But for switching specifically, it's actually pretty good. What's great about LMS is that it just provides you with constant fights with no time spent banking or world hopping in between. And for a skill that relies so heavily on building muscle memory, that is a good thing. So for instance, using LMS to warm up before you go wildy PKing is a good way to get your switches ready and get some practice reps in. You can also go PvP arena as an alternative to LMS, but you'll need to spend some time finding a good fight, and you won't make any money either. So unless you're really sick of LMS, I'd lean towards that as the most efficient option. Now when you do decide to go wilderness, I'd advise just mixing up your PK spots so you spend some of the time going for PVMers, but also go places where you get some proper NH fight. Hunting PVMers, you can practice spec combos and more advanced fakies without forgetting you were suddenly Voidwaker spec'd on 20 HP, but to learn switching patterns from both an offensive and defensive standpoint, you also need some legit NH fights. This might be hurting both your ego and your economy in the beginning, but I think it's important to fight other PKers that actually put you under pressure and force you to learn how to eat in deep wild, as this is a part of the switching rhythm that LMS doesn't really teach you. LMS is great for gear and prayer switching, but as I said before, maintaining high HP throughout a fight isn't as necessary since you have so many fish that you can always eat up from low HP situations. You don't need to go World 304 also to find deep wildy fights though. There is actually a PK spot that regularly delivers both PVM hunting and NH fights. I'll dive deeper into that in my next video, so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you'd like to know more about that. The last thing for practice is a little ridiculous of an idea, but just for learning the cursor movement specifically, I think cleaning herbs or a similar activity that requires the same clicking patterns as NH switching does is actually not too bad. Use this if you're struggling and need to get back in rhythm, or as a 5 to 10 minute warm up to get ready for PKing if you're sick of losing an LMS. And you'll make a little money in the process, something you might need to finance those early PK struggles. For learning switches as fast as possible, PKing on a main is definitely the way to go. Since tank gear hardly exists for pures, you won't get to practice that aspect at all when PKing on a 1 defense account. On the other hand, it's way easier to get kills on a pure than on a main, so for a noob to have fun and avoid a burnout, pure PKing still teaches you plenty of switches to learn from. If you have access to both, PK on your main when you have confidence and on your pure when you need it. I didn't really go into advanced fakies using two-handed weapons and other aspects with a higher skill floor, as I think just learning the fundamentals is most important if you're new. Focus on tank flicking, brewing and putting between switches, and flicking your offensive and defensive prayers together. And remember that even after a good day of PKing, you still might suck tomorrow, but in half a year, you will be much better.